HighBridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents Indefinite, Doing Time in Jail by Michael L. Walker. Read by Earl Mclean. Introduction. Palace de Excreta. When I think about jail, my mind goes to Tuesday, February 7th, 2008. My birthday. Not that it mattered, because who celebrates being 31? At only 9 a.m., I was slowly roasting in my uninsulated campus housing unit. I'd walked my son Micah to school and was mulling the day's agenda. In a few hours, I would go before a university judicial affairs committee to beg for a reprieve for having been arrested on university property several months before. The charges had nothing to do with the university, and the case was in the early stages of adjudication. But if my hearing with that committee went unfavorably, I could be suspended from the graduate program or expelled from school altogether. I stared at the dust clinging to my TV and obsessed on wild contingencies, always with the same end: some combination of losing my son, prison time, and a violent death. In moments like these, when standing at the cusp of fortune and tragedy, my grandmother played music and cleaned the house. She handed that habit down to my mother. So when I was a child, if I heard the Gap Band or Kool and the Gang or Luther Vandross playing on Saturday or Sunday morning, I knew my mother was cleaning the house and maybe clearing her mind to see more clearly whatever it was that she was dealing with. Music marks all potentialities. The meeting wasn't for a few hours, so I figured maybe if I took the bus down to the courthouse and set up a payment plan for old traffic tickets, the gesture could work like a deposit in the cosmic good deed bank that I could withdraw with interest later in the day. I put on my cleanup playlist and piddled around my place to Michael Jackson, Earth, Wind and Fire, and Heavy D. I skipped around on the CD until I heard the opening chords to Little Bluebird. I was a kid again, in the kitchen with a spoon, throwing my back into every "oh" with my grandmother in the audience. I grabbed Milana Karenga's book Mott and headed out the door. I'd started and stopped the book more times than I could remember, certainly as often as I started and stopped anything else. Still, working through the day's calculus, it seemed sensible to take a treatise on ethics to the courthouse. On the bus, I stared at the book's cover, from which I'd gotten my tattoo, rubbing the Egyptian hieroglyphics on my neck. I wondered whether it says what I mean for it to say, or was I one of those idiots who thinks he's inked dragon-hearted, but it's actually the Japanese word for pencil. I reminded myself of an encounter with Tia Moyo Karenga after a meeting to put subacre farms in Los Angeles communities. Nefer Mott, she read from my neck, with soft confidence. I must have it right. The courthouse waiting area was populated with the usual suspects: a frustrated baby, people talking too loudly into their cell phones, people in work clothes huffing their annoyance. I hadn't read a single word from Mott when my name was called ahead of others. The clerk stabbed his fingers at his keyboard, toggling between screens without looking up, while I explained, cheerfully for some reason, that I wanted to set up a payment plan for whatever traffic violations I might have. His eyes never left the screen, and I caught myself filling the air with extraneous information before realizing I wasn't there to make a friend, or even to exchange in friendly small talk. I was there to facilitate the filling in of electronic forms. It was like being one of the legions of faceless bad guys whose sole purpose in movies is to get whooped on by the protagonist. In that instant, the clerk appeared to me as the government clerk, a kind of social object that I'd encountered in other courthouses, DMVs, Department of Motor Vehicles, and Social Services offices. Our silent mutual objectification was broken when he unceremoniously dismissed me to the waiting area because he needed to prepare some documents. I sat on one of the colorful plastic chairs and thumbed through Mott, I was surprised to see that according to scribbles in the margins, I'd made it all the way to page 173 at some point. But I didn't remember any of it, so I started at the beginning. I was still committing my mind to reading the book instead of looking at the first pages when two sheriff's deputies approached. "Mr. Walker," one began, "stand and face the wall." Stunned, I complied. My wrists readied themselves for handcuffs before the deputy took them from his belt, long before I understood why I was being detained. Later I learned that the charges associated with my earlier arrest had been changed. A warrant had been issued, and I had merely simplified its execution by presenting myself in the courthouse. "Is this your book?" the other deputy asked. I nodded with docility. One of the pair then guided me by a wrist down the hall, through a door camouflaged by paneling, and into a series of narrow capillaries stealthily connected to the building's arteries. We made what seemed like an unusual number of lefts and rights through so many doorways before arriving at a cramped office. I doubt I could have found my way out without help. My escort sat me in a chair in a thoroughfare between doors on opposite ends of the office. The tiny room was an administrative getaway where deputies filled in forms, traded jokes, and apparently held arrestees. Something about the blinds in the window turned the room's sunlight a shade of amber. Gray filing cabinets seemed piled into towers, and there was a cartoonish amount of paperwork on nearly every surface. My escort sat at a desk and began fiddling with papers and chatting with another deputy. Until that moment, everything seemed to be happening in silence. But as I sat handcuffed and facing the clock on the wall, shock started wearing off. Reality thundered in. This is really happening right now. Few activities, if we can call it that, are as troubling as watching a clock tick. What exquisite torture to watch the second hand tick forward, and the more I stared, the more it seemed to tick slower, then in place, and then backward before ticking forward again. Deputies came in and out of the office, walking around me, talking past me. I fidgeted in my chair, but not too much, while deputies playfully punched each other's arms and made evening plans. At first, their carefree banter seemed to have nothing to do with me. But then I got it in my head that they were ignoring me on purpose, like they wanted me to feel unimportant. I felt a growing tension between wanting to be left alone, maybe they'll give me a ticket and let me go, and a desire to be acknowledged as a fully sentient being and active participant in the ongoing situation. A deputy asked me if I needed to call anyone. Shit, Micah. I left a message on my mother's cell phone. Just the facts. I've been arrested. I'll probably be in the Providence downtown jail. Please pick up Micah from school. More than an hour passed before my escort announced he was ready to take me to jail. He didn't say that. He just put a hand on my left shoulder and told me to stand. I stood. He moved his hand down my inner bicep and began guiding me through a labyrinth of corridors, crawling with a colony of deputies that greeted each other like ants as they passed. We took an elevator down. Where are we going? And arrived rather magically at the entrance of a bunker. The Providence downtown jail's intake area. Before that moment, it had never occurred to me that the jail connected the courthouse like that. But that's the thing about jail. It gives you a netherworld feeling while being in the center of city and town life. You're strangely home and not. Disappeared and present. Shit. A deputy working intake opened the door, and my escort handed me off. Intake was the same cold, banasic place it had been weeks prior. A dinosaur of a voice gave the standard commands. Gentlemen, stay inside the red line. Face the wall. No talking. I did as I was told. When one of the deputies pacing the line gave the instruction, I removed and held my belt, socks, and shoes in one hand, using the other to hold up my pants. When it was my turn, I approached the property desk, placed my palms flat in front of me, and spread my feet to the desire of the deputy standing behind me. The deputy behind the desk worked like an automaton, filling in parts of a form for me the way he had done for every captured man in intake. I made the dumb decision to read the form. There was a place to catalog my personal items, and there was a place to record my general disposition. I signed it, and should have been done. But call it frustration, and it was, partly, though it was much more about interrupting what felt like the violence of a procedure to claim some small measure of dignity and be acknowledged as a person, because I was, after all, in fucking jail on my birthday, when all I'd wanted to do was pay some traffic fines. I pointed at a particular line on the form, looked flatly at the deputy, and declared, "You shouldn't have checked that box with no history of mental illness." He studied me, and then asked whether I thought I might be a danger to myself or others in that moment. "I don't know what I might do," I replied without breaking eye contact. He remained impassive and quiet as he gathered my property and paperwork. He didn't say another word. Another deputy appeared at my side instantly and led me to a small staging area. There he calmly instructed me to strip naked. That wasn't how intake normally went. But he didn't offer an explanation, and I didn't ask. Instead of the standard disintegrating socks, broken eraser-colored sandals, white t-shirt, sullied boxers, and faded orange top and bottom pieces, I was handed a heavy green nylon gown. It was like a hospital gown, but held together on one side with Velcro straps. He shuffled me past the usual pre-housing holding units before nudging me into a single-occupant cell. He closed the door behind me. No words, no explanation. I didn't ask any questions. I stood by the door for a moment. Then my senses brought the 10-foot by 10-foot cell into focus. The walls were painted the familiar shade, institutional agony, a McDonald's French fries and champagne beige vomit color. The floor was soft epoxy, chilled by a malevolent breeze that crisped my ankles and wafted the fetor of festering rectums by gone. The gag-inducing stench was no mystery, a madman. Could one man produce this much shit? Had made a masterpiece of tactile art. Everywhere I looked, fresh, pungent shit was smeared, smudged, splattered, and clumped. An encased security camera in the upper left-hand corner of the room was covered in wads of feces. The security lighting fixture was blotched with flung excrement. In the bottom right corner of the room was a metal grate around which the floor sloped. No bench, no bed, no toilet sink combination, no table, no chair. The cell was an empty box. The floor was checkered with ordure and dried urine stains. Because if you don't give a fuck about your own crap, why worry about where you piss? Wait, am I standing in piss? I turned on the balls of my feet toward the cell door. Gah! The 4 feet by 8 feet safety glass was besmirched with fecal streaks. I stared at that sin with my lips curled. A person had made that cell look like that. Other persons allowed and ignored it, and apparently civilized beings believed it was rational to put me in there. I don't know what I might do. Why in the fuck did I say that? The goings-on in the hall were muffled by the walls, and I could barely make out anything through the smeared safety glass. They'd forgotten me. I stood before the little window and hoped someone would come get me. By now, Mom had gotten Micah. At least, she's heard my message and got on the road or called Nicole. Thoughts darted like shooting lasers in different directions. I needed my mother to come through for me, for Micah. I'm fucking up. Like my whole life, right now. Like I'm fucking it all the way up. And I gotta stand in this literal shit. I gotta stand here in all this shit and piss and God only knows what else. I gotta stand in it all. Had I been in the cell for an hour, longer, there were no obvious markers of the passing of time, so I decided to sing songs. A verse or two didn't count. It had to be the entire song, including the ad-libs, for an accurate measure of time. If I would have had the music, I could have sung along to thousands of songs, but in that moment, I could only call to memory Guy's Let's Chill, Bilal's Sometimes, and the notorious B.I.G.'s Unbelievable. So, I stood just inside the Palace de Excreta, singing and rapping to myself those songs. I guessed that each song was about 3.5 minutes long, but I lost track of how many times I sang each one. Often, I started over when I stuttered, or enjoyed a particular verse, or when I wanted to get the ad-libs just right. Also, I'd been standing long enough for my legs to be tired, and I reasoned that if my legs were tired, I must have been standing for 6 to 8 hours. But I argued against myself that using the tiredness in my legs missed the whole point of singing in the first place, that it was insane to think I could accurately track time by leg tiredness, especially with a more viable tool at my disposal, if I would have just counted how many times I sang. That camera must not work. Why else would they allow this room to look like this? They must not know what it looks like or what it smells like in here. Shit. I'll be dead in here weeks before anyone remembers to find me. The fuck time is it? It's a wrap for school. I gotta sit. I can't stand forever. There was no obviously safe place to sit. I settled on a spot to the left of the cell door, hopscotching there, and wondering whether my weary quadriceps would go limp or ease my body to the ground. My legs split the difference, and I performed a controlled fall into place with my legs at askew to avoid resting in crap. The nylon gown was at least a barrier between my back and the wall. Stillness. Then, the terrible cycle. Fear heated and rose brightly before sinking and darkening as I cooled it. But then, more feelings rose, brighter, more intensely hot ones, and I couldn't cool them all at once. Just raw emotions, tied loosely to images, but no clear thoughts. I couldn't manage them. I bellowed loudly and shamelessly like an animal caught in a trap. The sound was startling, like hearing the sorrowful cries of someone else. But it was my chest heaving and my bottom lip sucking in and out between gasps. I cried like I lost a child, and in a way, I had. I lost a portion of my intrinsic innocence, that moral simplicity, that uncomplicated by the knowledge of experiences like that safety cell. When my lamentations passed, there was yet the cold draft on my feet, knees, and scrotum. The reality of fecal finger paintings, and me, alone, and I hated myself for crying useless tears. Keys at the cell door. I sprang up. A deputy offered a styrofoam carton of food and skim milk through a slot in the door that I somehow hadn't noticed. I accepted the food, for some haunting reason, with a pleasant attitude, using the normal niceties. The fuck do I have to be so happy about? Frustrated, I returned to my spot to tough down a ham sandwich on white bread, cookies, and the jail's version of coleslaw. My hands were unwashed hands, and I was surrounded by excrement. It's gonna be some super cholera or E. coli that gets me. Exhausted, I figured that I was getting the jail's version of mental health treatment for persons perceived as a danger to themselves or others. Take him to the palace. I blamed myself. I could have been processed like anyone else, but I was a frustrated smartass who grabbed a stupid opportunity to disrupt the deputies' automatonic behavior. But did deputies really believe that time in the palace would be helpful? It seemed I was being told, "We know how to handle guys like you." I had no idea how long I'd been in there, but I guessed that I would be there for at least 72 hours, so I accepted that I could not stay awake the whole time. Sleeping against the wall wasn't going to work. I might have dozed, leaned too far to one side, and landed in shit. Nope, I stood, opened the nylon dress, spread it on the floor, and climbed my naked body atop. It was a raft in contaminated waters. My bare back bore the brunt of the wintry breeze as I curled into a fetal position trying to keep my legs from touching the floor. My tendons fought the effort, so I gripped my legs around the shins, interlocking my fingers to prevent even a toe from touching the toxic floor. I closed my eyes. How long have I been here? Did I sleep at all? Wait, the trip on the bus, the arrest, intake. When is the last time I peed? I'm not going to be able to hold it until someone comes to get me. If someone comes to get me. My bladder was near failure before I decided to do something about it. No one was watching, but I refused to deign to the level of the cell. I stood, covered myself, and then navigated the gauntlet of human waste so that I could pee into the grate in the far corner of the room. I returned to my spot on the wall. No sleep for now. Almost immediately, a weighted sadness settled on my chest, and my gut started cramping. I felt like I was imploding and exploding at once. The more I sobbed, the more I hated myself for it. My humiliation, guilt, regrets, and wretchedness seemed manifested in the everywhere shit. I didn't think about it. I acted. I opened the styrofoam food container and broke the plastic spoon I'd been given, trying to get a sharp enough edge to open my wrists. The spoon wasn't sturdy enough to snap into shards, and I couldn't sharpen the plastic against the soft walls or floor. I bit a thumbnail off to the quick and used it to dig into my skin. I stabbed at my wrists, knowing that I needed to cut lengthwise if I was to bleed out properly. My hands were sweating as I rotated between the fingernail and the spoon, working at my wrists until I could see a vein behind the white meat of one arm. I was so tired that I had to encourage myself to keep going. It's got to be an easier way. You got to be insane to break your own neck. Are you insane, Michael? I applied torque to my neck. Fuck. I ain't crazy, but I don't need to be to open these veins. Just got to be determined. But this would hurt less if I were insane. Having drawn blood on one wrist, I closed my eyes and hoped life would drip from my body. Did I fall asleep? How long has it been? I hadn't bled enough for even a small pool of blood to form, so I gnawed at my wrist, but it hurt, and I wasn't sure whether I had the resolve to bite and bleed the way I needed to. I wasn't insane, yet. A deputy delivered more food and later a cup of water. I couldn't remember the last time I had water. I ate, drank the skim milk and the water, and I stored my trash in the corner to the right of my spot and left of the cell's door. Suddenly, a subtle grumble grew into a wrenching in my bowels. It felt like a strong man was scrunching my intestines. This must be how this room got like this. The food. There wasn't an obvious place to relieve myself, and I could not envisage myself pressing poop through the metal bars of the floor grate. The styrofoam container would have to be my commode. Afterward, I stored the container and its ignoble contents in the farthest corner away from me. I switched between standing at the door, sitting in my spot to pick at my wrists, and laying down. After food was delivered a third time, I stacked the empty milk cartons into a makeshift pillow. This meant I could scoot my shoulders to the edge of the nylon dress bedroll apparatus because my head was resting on the cartons instead of touching the floor. That way, I didn't have to work so hard to keep my legs tucked. The drawback, of course, was that I had to remain perfectly still, or the stack of cartons would tumble, and I'd have to catch my head before it touched the ground. I was playing a version of the childhood game Hot Lava, except touching the floor really was dangerous. Deputies brought more food, more water. Do you need to flush? A deputy yelled at the cell door. I was utterly confused, so he gestured with his eyebrows and pointed past me to the corner grate. Do you need to flush? Oh, the grate. It's covering a pipe. A septic pipe. I thought for a moment about the human waste that must have been idling in that pipe. Yeah, I responded, nodding simultaneously. The deputy reached to his right beyond my view, and a rush of suction and water carried away a portion of my plot. Later, another deputy opened the metal slot to the palace. She wanted whatever trash I had. Shame vaulted down my spine as I handed over some mostly empty food containers and milk cartons. I kept my pillows before passing what felt like material disgrace and explaining mortifyingly, "This one has waste in it." She nodded and accepted it. Had I been in the palace for a day, 2 days, a young Asian American woman visited me. She kneeled to speak to me through the food slot, and I kneeled in my spot by the door, hoping she could see the sanity in my face. She showed me her badge and said she was from the county's Department of Mental Health. She stammered through a one-size-fits-all survey, glancing at me only occasionally. Several times she began a question, then halted and moved on when she realized that it was irrelevant to my situation. I was facilitating the filling in of a form again. I asked her whether she was there to help me or to read questions at me. "I want to help you," she replied unconvincingly. I started pushing her on the meaning of every question she asked. I sarcastically repeated her questions about whether I felt like hurting myself. "Do you mean before or after I was put in this shithole? Because that matters." I suppose I pushed her too far. Or maybe she was looking for an out. On the next survey item, she stopped herself. "You know what? It doesn't matter." She closed the hatch and was gone. I stayed kneeled at the door until I lost feeling in my toes and my knees ached. It doesn't matter. The words are strangely freeing. I gave up working on my wrists. The effort required feelings, and having resolved that it didn't matter, my emotions were evaporating. My legs still ached from kneeling at the door when the strong man's hands returned to wring my bowels. I used 2 spoons to lift the grate that covered the ragged hole in the septic pipe. No more styrofoam containers. There my waste festered until I could convince a deputy to flush the pipe for me. Unaccounted hours later, another woman came from the Department of Mental Health. Older, black, she had an auntie energy, like a woman who greets you with a smile and a warm plate piled high with more food than you could possibly eat. She wasn't carrying a survey. She wasn't there to evaluate me. Hers was a rescue mission. We conversed lightly. She told me that if I wanted to get out of the palace, I would need to tell the doctor who would be visiting me next that I was not suicidal or dangerous anymore. She assured me that if I told him I was better, he could get me out. It was a bit like being told that I needed only to click my naked heels 3 times. After all, I've been put in that god-awful place for my own good, right? And for the good of the jail? But all I needed to do was say I was fine, and I could be out of that cell. Perhaps a day later, perhaps 10 hours later, an East Indian American psychiatrist visited me, just like my auntie said he would. He was an oddly merry man with an infectious, upbeat attitude that gave me something like biblical faith in him. He asked me how I was feeling and whether I wanted to get out. Call and response. I said that I was better, that I wanted to live. "Okay, we'll get you out of there," he smiled. Revelations. When the deputy came for me, it was perfunctory, like he was getting a pair of white socks from a dresser drawer. Straight away, he marched me from the safety cell to a shower around the corner. I must have smelled like 10,000 dung beetles. I hadn't brushed my teeth or put soap and water on any part of my body for days. As I rinsed, shower would be an overstatement. I felt abstract, exaggerated, and deformed in that way when you emerge from an overly deep nap filled with terrible dreams, and you're confused and unsure about the contours of the waking world. Everything hurt. While getting dressed, I asked the deputy why no one had cleaned that cell. "We tried to hose it down."
Sample complete. Ready to continue?